The smell of antiseptic hung in the air like a confession. It clung to my scrubs, to my hair, to the hollow under my ribs where rent and grief and late-night fluorescent lights had formed a permanent bruise. It was 3 a.m. at Mercy General, and my feet ached in a way that told me I had been standing here too long for a body that wanted to stop moving. A nurse's life is the art of pretending fatigue is a costume you can peel off when the next cart slides in. I was good at pretending. They rolled him in behind curtain 4 with the politeness of professionals who'd learned to make violence ordinary. He came through on a gurney, a chest half exposed beneath a shirt already caked at the edge with blood. He was too clean to be a typical trauma patient. His collar had been pressed within the last hour. His skin was not flushed with panic, but with a strange, exhausted composure. And then I saw his face, briefly as they skimmed him past the triage desk, and something cold settled in my stomach. Eyes the color of glacier water, so clear they looked like an accusation. Dr. Patel slid me a chart with the same economy with which he'd learned to hand off what he could. 2 gashes right lateral torso, possible pneumothorax if air's moving under skin. He says he's allergic to pain meds. He won't do a CXR without consent. You do what you can. I'm on call. His voice was neutral. We both knew neutrality was a dress rehearsal for the choices someone else would have to answer for. I prepped the tray with the motions I'd practiced for years. Gloves, saline gauze, the antiseptic that smelled like cleaned promises. There's a small intimacy in those sterile routines, the close, practical handling of another person's frail body. When I pulled back the sheet, his breath hitched like a secret being told. The wound looked angry. The skin around it darkened with coagulated blood. He kept his gaze level with mine, as if watching me could keep him tethered to being treated like a person, not a code. You okay? I asked. It was reflex, and not really question. He straightened his shoulders like someone who had been taught to keep his spine a line of dignity. His voice, when he spoke, was low, careful. Yes, there were no hospital bracelets to match his name to a file. He refused the monitor. He refused the chest X-ray. He refused offers of morphine and the practical coaxing of nurses who'd seen men come to them with chests that collapsed and perfunctory pride. He allowed me to clean, to irrigate the wound in the measured way that keeps both patient and practitioner in a professional rhythm, to pack it with soaked gauze and to hand him clean blankets. He declined the catheter and the admitting paperwork like a man who knew the long forms of hospitals were as binding as handcuffs. When it came time to dress the wound, he shivered with a slight fever. I set the IV flush and explained antibiotics. Simple enough talk to keep trust on a leash. He looked down at the money I'd slid back to him from a tip jar when a mother had insisted on leaving cash for the night staff. He frowned at my hand, and then, abruptly, he took a thick roll of bills from his pocket and laid them across the foot of the bed with an even, almost ceremonial calm. Discretion, he said. The word was casual and not a request. I should have refused. Everything in me should have refused. I had been trained to file, to document, to witness. There was a box for ethics, a box called Refuse External Pressure, and every time the hospital's training module asked, "What would you do?" the screen blurred into a moral outline I believed in. But rent reminders had been stacked on my dresser beside a small box of my fiancé's watch, both of them paper ghosts that spoke louder at night than the script of my training. Mr. I glanced at the chart, but it held an alias, a name that might have been stitched from a tailor's memory. "Call me Salvatore," he said. The syllables were smooth. They felt like a hand sliding across silk. I took the money because I needed to. I wrapped his wound, tucked the ends of the gauze like a seamstress finishing a garment. He watched me work like I was sculpting something valuable out of him, or maybe like I was preserving an object his enemies would have liked to break. When I stepped back from the bed and pulled my gloves off, there was a quick, almost intimate silence where the world rebalanced itself around the small predation of suffering. He left with a manager's nod. No hospital room, no forwarding address. He had the look of a man who moved through problems the way some people moved through crowds, with a practiced sidestep and the comfortable certainty of a predator in its element. His hand brushed mine as he thanked me. It was a touch, nothing that should have mattered, but it hummed in the space behind my ribs. An hour later, his number flashed in on a burner phone I didn't have to answer, but I found myself listening to the first syllables anyway. The line was granular in that way burner lines are, like a voice separated by static from its context. When he spoke, his tone was softer than the man in the ER. There was a hush of amusement around his words, a quiet that sat like a threat. "You did a good job," he said. "I need someone who knows how to hold a space that isn't a hospital. Someone who can make an infection look like a small problem. Someone who understands discretion." I told him no. That was the honest part of what I said. I told him I couldn't leave Mercy General. I told him about the on-call list and the liability and the ethics. He listened with the kind of attention that made silence feel tactical. "I'll come to you," he said finally. "If you truly cannot leave, then consider this an offer you refuse at your peril." The line went cold with a soft click that sounded like a curtain dropping. I put the phone down and laughed once, an empty, private sound. The laugh tasted like copper. Whatever this man was, and whatever his name legally, the world collapsed around him in a set of armed and tidy architecture I recognized from headlines and late-night feeds. He was dangerous. He was also someone who had been bled and repaired by my hands. The rent reminder on my dresser felt less like a bill and more like a ledger of decisions I had to make. If you like edge-of-your-seat romantic thrillers, subscribe and stay for the next twist. The next call didn't leave me a graceful option. It came with names I could not find on any public registry, and a tone that made my spine tighten like a finger down a piano wire. He knew where I lived. He knew who my manager was. He alluded to security footage. The hospital had cameras, the things in the corners that watched the way we moved and made us all look like actors under an indifferent light. The suggestion wasn't that they would punish me for touching a patient. It was that a private man with resources could make any ceiling fall where he pleased. He didn't threaten me explicitly. He never had to. When the black SUV pulled up to my apartment building, a taller man with a voice like sand and tobacco leaned into the passenger window and told me to get in. They blindfolded my eyes with silk so delicate it felt obscene against the skin of my lids, as if someone had wrapped sleep over violence to make it palatable. I balanced the silk with my own breath and let my ears set the map for where we were going. The sift of tires over highway, the faint thud of bass, the sound of two men who knew each other too well, talking in clipped sentences. When they finally took the blindfold off, I was not angry. There are kinds of anger that flow out of you like water, and other kinds that sit there heavy as iron. I had a new, low kind of anger waiting for something to call it. The mansion took up the road like an accusation. It rose like a museum of power, stone and glass, lawns trimmed with a precision that felt almost surgical. The place smelled like citrus and expensive wood polish, and that particular cold you get when rooms are cooled to preserve treasure. Men in dark suits moved like chess pieces. They were organized and quiet. The decorative lights hugged the edges of sculpted hedges. A fountain murmured in the center like a private river. He met me in a room that had no hospital smell at all. There was no antiseptic here. He sat in a chair that had been designed for someone who spends a life being looked at. Up close, the glacier blue eyes were not wounds but instruments, and something softer and more dangerous lived behind them. He had a cut near his clavicle, a glaze of stitches done somewhere rougher than my hands, and the skin around it was slightly discolored with early infection. He moved with the tilt of a man whose body had been a battlefield for a long time, and who showed it casually the way people show scars on their wrists. "This is where I stay," he said simply. "If you stay, you will understand why discretion is not only business, it is survival." I set up a tray on an ornate table that could have been the altar to a very different god. Marco, his lieutenant, observed from a doorway with an expression like a man holding knowledge too heavy for his chest. Sophia, the housekeeper, moved with a small silent efficiency that said she witnessed 1,000 private things and turned each of them into routine. Marco's voice was gravel. The tone meant he was the kind of man who had learned to map out violence and tidy it. "He doesn't like hospitals," Marco said to me. No question about my presence. "You fix. You leave. You don't ask questions you don't want answers to." "I follow standard care," I told him. It was both how I lived and what I promised myself in the mirror. But every promise has paper thinness to it when the paper is tested by a fist. The first night I cleaned the wound and repacked it without the formalities a hospital would demand. I used the same motions I had used in the ER, cleansing, gentle pressure, a steadying hand. He watched me with the close attention of someone who had not been seen for a very long time. When I leaned in to set a dressing, my hand brushed his chest, and he inhaled, not from pain, but from something like recognition, a greeting to an absent friend. There was an intimacy to that small touch that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with dependence. He asked me about my life with a curiosity that read like a map. He listened more than he spoke. When I told him the barest fact about my fiancé, about the funeral I'd held in a church that smelled of lilies, his face shifted like a prism. "I lose people," he said quietly. "You learn what to do to stop that from happening to you. We didn't sleep the way people who don't have to fight to keep their heartbeats steady sleep. We drifted in a room that hummed with the quiet of wealth, the sheets cool and unbelievable under my knees, the blackout curtains like a promise that the outside world could be removed." His vulnerability sat beside a threat I'd been carrying when I caught myself imagining leaving and never looking back. Developmentally, his confession arrived in fragments, a story of family and blood, of loss so old it had been made into architecture. His parents had been murdered when he was young. There was revenge taken. There had been a family that burned to the ground with the regularity of new calendar years, and somewhere along the line, he built a life on the rubble. "You can build an empire on the bones of those who wronged you," he said, "or you can bury it and pretend it never happened." I chose the first. His words were not a boast so much as a proof, and in the corners of the room men watched as if any misstep might rewrite the ledger of power. Marco warned me once more, in a tone that was soft as it was final. "You are not allowed to fall in love with what he does," he said. "Not young nurses, not young hearts. It's not a safe investment." But that evening, the line between protection and ownership blurred like ink in water. He would not call for anything that implied he could not be handled with respect. He offered me money, enough to erase the urgent clarity of leased apartments and cold dinners. He offered safety. He offered something that looked like an agreement. Stay nearby, use your skills on his people, don't ask questions. He said it with the casualness of a man who had bargained for the world. I refused him first, then accepted the small cash envelopes he left sliding across the coffee table like feathers. I kept thinking of my landlord's voice, and the lease's fine print and the pharmacy bills stacked like a white mountain on my kitchen counter. I kept thinking of the watch my fiancé had left behind, the watch that still ticked although no hand could wind it anymore. Sophia found the tracker. She did not make a show of it. She swept into the small staff kitchen, where I had gone to steal a cigarette I didn't even want. She set a small black thing on the counter, a little cylinder no longer than my thumb, cold and ridiculous. "When you are ready," she said. Her eyes were not the quick private ones of a housekeeper gossiping. They were the eyes of a person who had seen enough to know how people died. I picked it up between 2 fingers like a small stone and felt suddenly its weight. Not the literal weight, but the moral one. "Why is this in my bag?" I asked. Marco's hand reached for it with a kind of professional calm that was more chilling than displays of anger. "Because you were used," he said. "Because he knew you would be the least suspicious place to stick something, and because Costa's people, they watch where our people go. This was always bait, Emma. You were never just a hired nurse." The room tilted in a way that made me think if I moved, the entire architecture of the night would reconfigure itself into a history I'd be trapped inside. "Bait," I repeated. The word tasted like a checkmate. I felt stupid. I felt angry. But above those feelings was another, a ferocious, pragmatic clarity. If I was bait, then my life had become a chess piece on a board I was only just starting to see. And chess can be played, even if only in small, grim moves. He took off his jacket and sat very still, the scar at his collarbone a pale ribbon on his throat. He told us a version of his history that was enough to be true in its bones, but softened in its edges. Family massacre, vengeance exacted, empire assembled from parts other men had left, a lineage of enemies that could not be negotiated away with flowers or lawyers. Costa, Victor Costa, was the kind of old-world rival who did not like things to be stolen from him, especially not people who served as bargaining chips. He and Russo had exchanged more than threats. They had traded body counts, territory, and reputations. A tracker in my bag was not a mistake. It was wisdom from a man who had learned the lesson that people he liked got watched. "You were used because of your distance," Marco said to me. "You are a nurse. You are clean. You touch people, and the city forgets to connect you back to the people who paid you." "What do you want me to do?" I asked, because the damaged human part of me always asked the question that meant something had to be done. "Stay," Marco said. "Learn the lines of men who will hurt you if you are naive. Learn who is dangerous and who is only dangerous when afraid. Be useful. Be useful, and you stay, because staying is safer than leaving when you are under watch." Russo did not make it an order. He offered choices the way a man with power always offers someone beneath him. Not a choice at all, but a framing that made the lever look like consent. There was a night the two of us folded into each other not because of lust alone, but because we were both learning how to be small in front of someone who could make us disappear. It was a careful, accidental intimacy. I was treating an infected site, and he held my hand in the gap between breaths, his fingers warm like a promise that someone was there to anchor me. The world outside had the shape of hedges and security, but when he exhaled into the crook of my elbow, the weight of his empire seemed irrelevant. There is a moment in care, in the small practical ministrations of medicine, where a hand becomes a lifeline. He clung to that lifeline in a way that felt almost like prayer. I asked myself if saving him had turned into a moral debt. When I checked my phone later, 3 messages stacked like a small avalanche, an anonymous tip, a picture of my building with an arrow to my apartment, and a timetable. Costa was mobilizing. 200 men had been counted under the sweep of surveillance early in the morning, all converging on my block. The photo was taken from a distance that suggested intent, and the message that followed was simple and clerical. Move, or else. It was the exact kind of escalation you read about in the news and think, that will never be your life. It was a line on a map until it became a heavy, practical plan to move or die. And for me, move was complicated. I had an apartment lease that staggered my budget, a night job at the hospital that was a kind of anchor both financially and morally. The idea of uprooting everything felt like running away in circles. That night I sat on a sofa that had never known permanent furniture and made lists. They felt small and ridiculous. Bank statements, a friend's couch, which of my plants I could save. On the kitchen table, there was still that thumb-sized tracker, its black shell catching the light like a small, unblinking eye. I imagined, if I stay, Russo will protect me, but protection costs freedom. If I go, Costa will still have my face, and he will not be satisfied until he has more leverage. If I refuse both, I know nothing about being alone with the kinds of men who vote with guns. I thought about the lesson Dr. Patel had given me during a quiet shift. Medicine is triage. You make choices with what is in your hands. There's technique, and there's what you can live with afterward. I folded the list, feeling like a surgeon before a long operation, and then I called someone I trusted, a friend whose name I used like an anchor when the world tilted. "Go to my sister's," she said, with the crisp practicality of the kind you want when you haven't enough of your own. "Leave tonight." "I can't leave the job mid-shift," I told her. It was an answer that was true. My life had obligations I had to keep. "Then at least change the locks," she said. "Do you even know where to hide if they come?" I didn't. I was a nurse. I knew how to keep someone alive, but not how to disappear without the kind of help crumbs of money and connections could buy. My ex-fiancé's watch still ticked on the dresser, like a thing pretending normality. The way Russo handled this was not what I expected. He did not send men right away. He did not storm through the walls with rifles and an arrogance that made me nauseous. Instead, he offered me an envelope with a plane ticket and a passport he had procured under a name that was not my own. He told me to take a place that was out of the city and away from view for as long as I could go. It felt like escape, a carefully packaged thing, but it also felt like an order disguised as care. "Stay with me," he said half an hour later. "If you stay, you won't have to pretend not to be watched." I thought about the watch on my chest and the way the lease read like a sentence. I thought about the 200 men in the photograph and the timetables. I thought about Sophia's quiet hands and Marco's paternal warnings, and I made a choice that was less about courage and more about the weight of immediate practicalities. I agreed to go home, pack a bag, and be ready. Russo's men would arrange safe transport out of the city. He said it with the confidence of someone who didn't like loose ends. The next morning, I unlocked my apartment as if it were a stage. The building smelled like baking bread and the neighbor's cheap perfume. I tried to move like someone who had not been taught to look below and behind every corner. I packed a bag, 2 changes of scrubs, a pair of jeans, my fiancé's watch wrapped in a paper towel. I felt ridiculous smuggling normal things away. I told myself leaving was a temporary measure. At noon, the first sound was the heavy thud of boots on concrete, a rhythm like a drum announcing the charge. It was too many for the usual city noise, too coordinated for coincidence. I stood at the peephole and watched a mass of men in makeshift grim uniforms gather at the bottom of the stairwell. There were faces I had never seen, and faces that looked like the ones in the photograph. The air smelled different. It smelled like money laundered through fear on wet cloths. I fumbled for my phone with fingers that didn't quite belong to me, and found another image in my messages, a picture of my door taken from close up, a finger pointing at the lock. A text in understated type came. "Open now, or we take your neighbor." My first instinct was to run to the hospital. A ridiculous notion, a place full of staff and cameras, and the one place that would make sense as shelter for someone like me. Then I thought of Russo's voice, and the way Marco had said, "bait." They were not aiming only to scare me. They had leverage in mind. I moved like I had practiced every story about survival I had ever read. I took the kitchen knife and put it in a silverware drawer I knew everyone overlooked. Not because it was a weapon, but because it made me feel like I was doing something physical. I turned the deadbolt and chained the door and pulled curtains across the living room like a stage hand closing the curtain on a scene you are not ready to act in. I called 911 with a voice that tried to be steady and said my address, said people were gathered outside, and waited for the polite voice on the other end to tell me someone was on the way. The voice was helpful and empathetic, and also painfully slow. They started to hammer the door. I didn't understand numbers the way I'd been reading. 200 men became a tidal wave at my threshold. They hit the wood like a group of people trying to see if the world would bend to their force. I could hear them shout. The sound was rough and loud, and entirely not the world you expect to be part of. I felt suddenly foolish for ever believing I was the kind of person who could be hidden by envelopes of money or a carefully curated life. This was not a story about running away. This was theater with consequences. The first blow sounded like it cracked the door's resolve. The chain snagged and then gave with a metallic shriek that sliced through the apartment. A man shoved his shoulder against the panels and exhaled like someone who had been taught to break barriers the way you change light bulbs. Glass cracked somewhere, the neighbor's window maybe. And then there were the wet animal sounds of men rushing into a space that had not been theirs. I had to act. That was the only part of everything I'd been taught that still fit into what was happening. I could not fight 200 men. I could not bargain my way out with a passport he had already used to purchase my anonymity. But I could be a nurse in the small, brutal ways that saved a life. Compress a wound, create pressure, bind with what fabric I had. If a life had to be saved in the middle of chaos, it would be because of the training I had never surrendered. The first person to breach my living room was not wearing a face I knew. He was younger than I expected, 2 or 3 years younger, and he held his hand to his side like he had been hit. He stumbled under the person behind him and slammed into the couch. Blood bloomed at the seam of his jeans in a way that made my stomach lurch, like remembering a past I had been trying to keep in a drawer. "Help!" he said, breathless. The call had a confused urgency to it, like someone who'd been told they were 2 things at once, half invader, half victim. His eyes found mine and then went blank with the shock of someone who had not expected a woman to look at him with anything beyond the intention to subdue. I made a choice that surprised me. I went to him the way I go to any patient, slowly, hands visible, voice calm. I knelt and checked him, more by muscle memory than thought. His wound was a shallow puncture that had surprised me with how much blood a small hole could consider itself entitled to. I tore a strip from my shirt, unthinkingly, and pressed it to the wound. His breath was jagged, and the noise of men was like a storm at the edge of the world. "You shouldn't be here," I said softly, more to the world than to him. He coughed, and there was the metallic salt of blood in his mouth. "We were told there was a nurse," he said. The sentence seemed like a justification and a question both. "Maybe this is a mistake," I told him. "Sometimes the truth is a practical thing. Get pressure on the bleeding, call for help. Don't let the panic speak for you." The panicked men outside tried the door again, and the sound of wood splintering was like the slow snapping of a branch. My hands were steady in a way I didn't feel, pressing the rag hard against the wound. 2 men burst into the hallway, voices raw. They saw me with the boy on the couch, and for a beat, their aggression flickered like a faulty bulb. The sight of a woman tending a wounded man was an image that didn't compute with a plan they'd rehearsed outside. "Get her," one of them began, but their leader, a wider man young enough to be a son my age, barked sharp words that were all edge and no choice. "Leave her," he said. It was not a kindness. It was a strategic choice. In a war for leverage, a nurse who began saving lives distracted more than desired. My phone buzzed with a call. The display read, "Marco." My hands did not stop moving when I took the call. "You okay?" he said, the voice in my ear like a practiced anchor. "There's a man here," I said, because my professional honesty was a tool. "He's bleeding." "Keep him alive," Marco said. "Do not engage. They are trying to get you to show yourself." "Why did they—" The sentence stopped, because wood splintered and a gunshot thudded through the air with a sound so close I felt it under my sternum. They were not trying to send a message to me alone. They were trying to recalibrate the world, to demonstrate force, and to declare they could reach the people Russo cared about. The boy on the couch was not an empty canvas, but a rung on a ladder. They wanted Russo to climb it. I realized in that moment how naked the city had made me. A nurse who could save someone and whose saving might be used as the leverage of others. It was a moral rectangle with me pressed in the center, edges sharp and waiting. The gunshot had been followed by a silence that hummed. The man on the couch had gone still under my hands. His breathing was thinner, and it felt like something had been taken from him. Where my hands pressed, there was warmth, and where the door had been, now there were splinters splayed like the ribs of some broken architecture. "Russo," I said into the phone, the name like an offering or an accusation. "You need to move. Now." For a long second his voice did not come. I supposed he was a man of positions and logos and weapons, but he had an Achilles heel the size of a heartbeat. He cared about control. "I'm sending people," he said finally. It was not urgency that sharpened the words, but a cold, administrative sort of command. "Hold your position. Keep him breathing. Do not make yourself a target." I pressed a palm harder, making a tourniquet out of the strip of shirt with techniques I wasn't sure I was allowed to reveal even to myself. It wasn't elegant. It was essential. Feet pounded up the hall. Commands barked like weather. The apartment shook with the force of men who had decided to rewrite the rules. A crowd of 200 is not a person to be reasoned with. It is the shape of intent, the way a storm crouches outside a window and prepares to break the glass. They had come for me because I had touched a man with ice-blue eyes. They had come to take something Russo still held dear, a small, fragile currency called leverage. I felt suddenly that entire minutes of my life had been a training montage for this moment. How to keep someone alive in chaos. How to soften a panic into breath that could be counted. How to use small acts of care to hold a space intact. The doorknob burst inward with a force that made me lurch forward and lose my grip. Splinters kissed my knuckles. The smell of wood and blood and fear braided together. Men entered like a flood made of sound and shadow and breath. The first thing I saw was the look in their eyes, not the brotherhood of battle, but the practiced cruelty of pawn-takers. They moved toward me with an expectancy that unsettled me like an old fear. I backed away, holding the boy tighter, my fingers cramped around fabric and bone and decision. Marco's voice was alive in my ear, shouting a list of names I half recognized, telling me where to go and what window to watch. I had to trust it a little and distrust it a lot. I had to trust that Russo's men were on their way and distrust that any rescue came without a cost. The boy on the couch looked at me with the exposure of someone who had been used 100 times to justify 1,000 strategies. He said nothing. Instead, he closed his eyes and let me press the rag deeper. We both waited for the next violent sound, the next verdict. Then over the hullabaloo, a different sound crawled into the apartment, the far-off rumble of engines, like angels on the freeway, but angrier. The men in my living room looked toward the windows. Outside, black SUVs had ringed the block. Russo's men, orientation and very bad news for Costa's planners. Someone shouted, and the tide of men froze for a breath that might have been fate or just caution. "Close the door," Marco barked into the phone. "Lock everything. Don't move unless I tell you." The men in the apartment started to argue behind me, voices sharp with the smell of panic. The leader with the young face pushed anyone who breathed like resistance. He looked at me then with something close to curiosity. And in that look I saw the calculus of someone who understood leverage. "She helped one of ours," he sneered. "We get him back, right? We make Russo bleed." "You're making a mistake," I said, "because sometimes a voice is a weapon that can be used without physical contact. You think hurting me will get to him? He has too much to lose." He laughed, a sound that did not understand the cost of blood. "We have 200 men. We have numbers, and numbers move faster than money." Those words were both true and irrelevant. Numbers don't always win. The next thing that happened was not a plan I had, but a chaos of decisions that began to shape a new reality. A man behind a splintered chair raised something. Metal glinted like an unblinking eye, and fired. The sound distorted everything like a bell rung with malice. The room exploded into movement. I was no longer only a nurse. I was a woman who had seen people bleed for the practical cause of making them stop bleeding. My hands were covered in someone else's consequence, and it was a weight I had to bear. I pressed my palms again on a hole that refused to be contained and breathed in a rhythm that was thin and disciplined. My heart hammered in a tempo that had no time for poetry. For now, the street was a line of players, and I was a piece they had chosen to test. The door was shoulderless and broken and betrayed by cheap metal. In the hall, the sound of 200 men was no longer merely a threatening rumor. It was a lived reality, a crowd rising and falling in coordination. My phone was a dead anchor in my purse, because the signal had died like a candle in a draft. Marco's voice was a thin thread, then silence. I tapped the phone. The screen blinked stubbornly. No service, as if the city itself had agreed to look away. Men moved like waves. A lamp shattered. A shout became a cut. I could hear someone crying out another man's name like a prayer gone wrong. My hands were slick, but not with the kind of blood that would make you faint. This was the gritty, honest blood of an accidental inhabitant of violence. My knuckles stung. The couch cushion under the boy's shoulder was darkening like a bruise. I did the only thing I knew that could still anchor a moment in the storm. I kept pressure. I kept whispering. I kept being small and clinical, in a way that made the violence around me feel like poor theater compared to the insistency of a human body begging to live. His eyes fluttered open and he found mine and spoke without the theater of threats. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, voice raw. "Because bleeding is bleeding," I said. The answer felt thin and also complete. Something heavy hit the hallway. Someone barked a word I couldn't make sense of. Step after step, there was a choreography to them, a trained brutality that had been practiced on fields far away from my living room. A man in a leather jacket lunged past the couch, grabbed the back of my shirt with fingers that stung, and dragged me up onto my feet like a marionette's string had been yanked. "Where is she?" he demanded into my face, breath rank and hot. He smelled like cheap cologne and old whiskey in a city at midnight. His eyes were small, efficient. He thought leverage could be extracted like honey from a jar. "You don't have to do this," I said, and the sentence was a plea, but also a direction. "There are children in this building. You can still walk away." His laugh was a thing that didn't entertain the thought of leaving. "We don't leave until we get what we came for." A gun leaned against the sofa arm like a rude flower. Someone behind me, another of the gang, stomped toward the kitchen and then paused, watching me with the interest of anyone who had found a prop in a rehearsal and wondered how to use it. Maybe they thought terror would be profitable. Maybe they thought cruelty had the same currency no matter whose hand it came from. Then the sirens started in the distance. Not the polite ambulance sirens, but a different sound. Engines barking like hunters when prey chooses a bad hiding place. We all turned toward the windows. For a breath, the room thought of being a room and not a battlefield. The window blinds rattled like bones. Motor noise crescendoed. The men in my apartment froze as if an invisible hand had struck a chord that told them to listen. There was shouting outside, then a sound like a pressure drop. and then the back of the world crashed into the front. Black SUVs bearing down, men in dark uniforms spilling like a tactical knot. Russo's insignia wasn't a flag here. It was a posture. They moved faster than a rumor. They were organized, brutal in their own way, and very, very efficient. For a moment I could only feel the cadence of my heart, which had become a metronome for everything still beating in the room. The leader of the attackers looked like someone who suddenly understood the arithmetic of their gamble had failed. He scanned the windows, the door, the couch, and saw the SUVs ring the block like a net. "Shit," he said. And then he began to shout in a different language, orders that were shorter and more panicked than before. The men scattered like water, finding lower ground. Some dove for the hallway. Others lunged for the windows to throw themselves outward into an escape that might have been pre-planned. A gun fired then, up close. I flinched and the boy's head lolled. The room filled with the scent of powder and the wet metallicness of fear. Someone had been hit again. I pushed past a man who tried to grab me and fell to my knees, hands colder and more certain than they had any right to be. "You have to breathe," I said to the boy on the couch, though my fingers were elsewhere, feeling for a pulse that thudded like a frantic drum. He was alive. Weak, yes, but alive. My hands found torn fabric, a small hole that bled black in the apartment light, and they went to work without the hesitation that gnaws at people in movies. They simply worked. Marco's voice returned like a rope tossed across a gorge. "Hold!" he snarled. The word was less an order than a pivot. "Get to the balcony. 2 men at the back stair. Wait for the third signal." I had no idea what the third signal would be. I only had my hands, my training, and the thin madness of being both a target and a shield. I could be useful. That was the calculus I could control. I half carried, half dragged the boy toward the balcony. My breath caught in a way that made the universe small. The balcony door was a single glass slab that had been spared the evening's violence until now. Marco's people worked fast, with the strength of men who had practiced lifting the world one person at a time. One of them, a woman I'd seen through the manor's glass, but here with a mask of grit, pulled me behind a stacked stack of potted plants and slammed something cold and authoritative into my hands, a radio. "Keep him quiet," she hissed. "Do not move unless I tell you." I pressed the radio close to my chest, and the boy's breathing grew more even under my palm, as if he had been reassured by the same human things that had always kept him alive. Steady weight, warm pressure, someone who would not flinch. I listened to orders crackle through like static prayers. The sound of boots outside shifted. The 200 were dispersing in the street either to flee or to form new lines. The ones who remained were more desperate, fractious with defeat. A voice came over the radio that made something in my chest drop with a strange relief. "Emma?" Russo's voice. There was no grand fanfare. It sounded like paper folded carefully, delivered to a desk. "Stay with him." "Where are you?" I whispered, because now the city had become a web, and every line could be cut. "Outside," he answered. "On the corner. Give me 5 minutes." It wasn't pleading. It sounded like someone who had just balanced a ledger. 5 minutes is a world when the air is full of the business of killing. It is also long enough for small tragedies. People bled. People yelled. Someone screamed my name, and it was not my name. The boy on the couch was quiet, and the sound of boots and the smell of wet fear swelled until it felt like you had swallowed winter. The balcony door groaned and then bucked. A gust of night air hit us, smelling of exhaust and wet earth, and a faint tang of the city that never learns to rest. The attacker who had first thrown the couch into chaos saw the opening and lunged. He slipped on the wet tiles, his boot catching the lip, and then he went over the edge, limbs scrambling for purchase on air. I watched his fall like someone watching a film and felt nothing at first, and then everything. the morality of watching a person fall, the facts that some falls are accidental and some are consequences. He hit the pavement below with a sound that wasn't cinematic. It was real, and it stopped the room in a way that had nothing to do with triumph. Rousseau arrived then, without fanfare, with the ridiculous slow dignity of a man who carries catastrophe in an immaculate suit. He came in the frame of his own dark coat, eyes like carved ice, and for a second the air rearranged itself. He looked at the boy, then at me, and he did not flinch. I had washed his wounds. I had sat in a room that smelled like his empire, and the smell of copper and fear and orange peel. He stepped forward, and the men who were left straightened like plant stems toward light. "You should never have been alone," he said to me, and the sentence held both accusation and apology in one breath. "I'm sorry." It was the kind of apology that was a negotiation. There was no full admission of the way his choices put me in danger. There was an observation that cut a room. He had called men, and they had arrived. He had sent a signal that rippled into a life. He had caused the chaos, and he also bore the apparatus that could end it. "We have police," Marco said curtly, to anyone who would hear it, like a necessary truce to frame the scene. "We can't pretend otherwise. There's going to be questions. There will be consequences." Rousseau's jaw worked. "We handle what needs handling," he said. Even the words carried legal weight. He spoke to the room like a man who knew how to make things invisible for a price. I moved because moving had become a sort of prayer. I leaned close to the boy's face and used the last calm breath I'd hoarded and said, "You're going to be okay. You're going to breathe. We're going to get you somewhere safe." He didn't know me, but he closed his eyes like a man who had been taught to accept small mercies. I felt a fury so hot it was almost clean rise in my chest. These men had come through my front door because someone considered me a pawn, but I had also been a person who could keep another person alive. That truth felt like a small victory. Outside, voices were changing. The 200 had scattered. Some were being led away by Rousseau's men. Others slunk into alleys like dogs with their tails between their legs. Somewhere down the block, a car burned out like an ember in an open pan, an emblem of something being consumed so that the scent would never quite leave. Later, when the adrenaline unspooled and my hands stopped smelling like fear, there would be a tally. A neighbor with a broken arm, an attacker who would not survive the night, a policeman with questions that would twist the hours into something public and ugly. For now, the room breathed in a rhythm of muted survival. Marco stood by the door like a sentinel who had seen too many endings. Rousseau sat on the edge of the couch and watched me. His gloves were off. His fingers were well kept, scarred slightly at the knuckles from fights that had given the world shape. He did not touch me. He seemed to be deciding whether touching me was an indulgence or a strategy. "You saved one of them," he said quietly, as if it contained pride and disdain in equal measure. "You saved him when the rest of the world wanted him for a bargain." "I saved him because he was bleeding," I said. I wanted my voice to be a scalpel cutting through any romanticism about what had happened. Because someone needed hands that knew how to keep someone breathing, not because I'm a bride of a man who has enemies. His eyes were a slow thaw. "You are not a bride to anyone," he said. "Not yet." Marco barked a laugh that was half anger, half relief. "You make deals and we clean up the mess," he said. "That's the history of all empires." I picked up the thumb-sized thing Sophia had left on the counter earlier, the tracker, and turned it over like a coin whose face had been smoothed. It was a small artifact of my loss of innocence, a device that had made me legible to someone else's map. It had made my existence an address. "You should have told me," I said at last to Rousseau. He rubbed his jaw, a small human move amid the armor. I thought it safer to keep it hidden. The admission landed like a confession. We try to control as many variables as possible. Sometimes that control is a poor thing. You used me, I said, because someone needed to name what it had been. The sentence sounded small in the huge room of his wealth. You were used because I am not good at doing this without edge, he answered. I ask, you give. That is the currency of my life. He did not say he regretted it. He simply stated a fact. I thought of my fiancé's watch, of bank statements, of the hospital's fluorescence, and the rusted iron promises of stability. I thought of Sophia's quiet fingers and Marco's paternal warnings. I thought of the boy on the couch and how he had bled for reasons that might never be fully honest or fully explained. Now what? I asked him. The question was practical and moral and small and large all at once. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out an envelope. It slid across the coffee table like a small boat with an important cargo. Inside were bills and a note folded with precise care. The money was enough to erase rent for 6 months, maybe to make the hospital's bills tolerable for a while. The note read, simply, "Stay with people you trust for now. We'll talk after quiet returns. I can protect you," he said. "If you stay with me, you'll be safer than on your own. We'll pay for whatever you need, but understand that safety is not the same as freedom." His terms came with a name, protection in exchange for proximity. He didn't ask me to be part of his life as a flavor or an accessory. He framed it as mutual convenience with the pretense of care. I could see, as clear as a window pane, the shape of the bargain. My presence near him made me safer. My presence near him also made me more valuable as a hostage, if someone else wanted to play hard. Marco's eyes were tired. "You can go to my sister's," he said, more than offered. "Stay with someone who doesn't even have a last name in our ledger." He underlined that my options were not really options, only different kinds of cages. The cage with him had velvet cushions. The cage without him had rust. "I can't pretend there's no cost," Rousseau said. He looked at me the way someone might look at a fragile artifact, respect, and the sense that it could shatter. "If you stay, you help us. You mend men who mend into me. You are not a pawn because you chose to be useful." The use of the word made my stomach drop. Useful sounded cleaner than indebted. It was a label, freighted with favor. It made me neither savior nor victim. It made me something in between, like a tool that could still choose how to be wielded. I slept that night on a sofa that smelled faintly of his cologne. The sheets were far too expensive for my logic to accept as comfort. In the dark, I thought of the neighbor downstairs, an old woman who had always sung to her flowers and whose window had been smashed. I thought of the hospital, of Dr. Patel and his neutral voice. I thought of the boy on the couch, who would be discharged later into a life that would keep no petition for why he had been used. The next day there were interviews. The police had questions. There were photographs. I answered with my hands still smelling faintly of antiseptic and fear. My name went into files. My presence at the mansion was a fact that would live next to other facts and then become a story that other people would tell. Someone took a statement. Did I know the man? Was I threatened? Would I press charges? Each question had the twin undertow of moral consequence and personal loss. I learned an ugly truth in those hours. When you touch someone with dangerous weight, your fingerprints smudge their ledger. They were going to want to know what I had done. They were going to want me to be either a fierce witness or a useful shadow. Authorities liked either or. Real life is mostly both and both in is noisy and complicated. Marco came to the hospital that afternoon with a covered thermos and a look that suggested he had been up too many nights in a row. He sat across from me in a small break room that smelled like reheated coffee and cleaning agents. "You did well," he said without sugar. "You saved a life." "You were going to let me die," I said. The truth had to be said harsh to be true. We never intended you to die, he replied. Mistakes happen, but we fix them. Fix them how? I demanded. By making other people disappear? Marco's face showed no satisfaction, only the hardness of someone who had learned to carry bad news with a quiet chest. We make sure people are not loose ends, he said. That's how we avoid wars. I thought of the boy on the couch. I thought of the man who fell from my balcony. I thought of the neighbor's broken arm. Blood had consequences. Blood made debts. That evening, Russo drove me back to the mansion because going anywhere alone had become an act of foolish independence. The drive was quiet. He let me talk. He let the city unspool outside the car like a film he had no interest in seeing. When we arrived, the manor looked like a thing that had weathered something and yet refused to show scars. The fountain still gurgled. The men still walked like chess pieces. Life continued in the way of people who have practiced living inside danger. He offered me a key, an absurd simple key, brass, warm in my palm. If you accept, he said, you'll have a place to come to, not a prison, a place with walls and people who can delay the world from getting to you. It felt like a setup. A key is a symbol both of access and of confinement. My fingers felt ridiculous holding it. What's the catch? I asked. I could see clearly, oh, how clearly, what the exchange might mean. The catch is, you don't pretend the world is clean, he said. You come with eyes open. You make a call when you need it. You don't ask me to be less than I am. I'll ask you to be better than you have to be. I thought about my fiancé's watch, ticking on the dresser like a heartbeat in a different room. I thought about how the hospital's fluorescent lights would never look like home. I thought about how my hands knew how to hold dying people, and how my hands could now be used by men who made people die. There was a hunger in me then, for safety, for the ability to breathe in a life that did not feel like a ledger, for money to pay bills and bury grief. There was also a well of stubbornness. I would not be only a thing that could be bought or bartered. I had agency. I had ethics that sometimes wore thin but did not vanish. I asked for stipulations. I had the right to ask. He smelled like his cologne, a memory of a man shaped by inevitability, and he listened. I wanted the right to go to work at the hospital. I wanted to be able to visit my fiancé's grave. I wanted Sophia to have wages and Marco to be accountable in ways that did not demand silence for crimes. I wanted, petty and human, my plants to be tended. He answered each with a careful negotiation. Some he granted outright. Others he accepted as compromise, not concession. He could not promise he would never be violent. He could promise to keep me safe from those he counted his enemies. A small, equivocal guarantee. He promised money and cover, and the right to leave for work. He refused to be anything but himself, which meant the arrangement would always be precarious. It meant my safety would be secured by someone who had built institutions on the bones of people he had lost. We made a bargain of sorts that night. Less a marriage contract than a ceasefire between two people who had been damaged in different ways. He gave me the key. I gave him a promise that I would not become a liability he could not manage. I did not promise love. I did not promise obedience. I promised to be useful. In the months that followed, the city breathed like a patient on a monitor, sometimes regular, sometimes jagged. I went back to Mercy General for shifts that sometimes felt like revealing how close to both worlds I had become. The staff whispered. There were news clippings. There were the occasional pointed looks from people who believed there are only a few ways to be compromised. I worked my day shifts, and then I went to a house that had more rooms than I had known existed. I learned the names of the men who kept the compound like a fortress. I kept a bag at Marco's sister's house sometimes. I took long walks with Sophia, who taught me how to prune roses and to keep the living things in your life tended. Romance came like a weather change, quiet, suspicious, not a storm, but a slow rain that makes the ground soft. There were nights when Russo and I sat at opposite ends of a terrace and spoke about things as innocuous as books and as dangerous as where loyalty ends. He told me more of his history in fragments, arms deals disguised as funerals, a mother's laugh in a photograph now blacked out by grief, the arithmetic of revenge. He told me he loved people in a way that was about possession and about protection, because those were the categories he knew. I told him I loved my fiancée in a way that was a grief that could not be negotiated. We were two people living in the same house of regret. There were tender things. The way he left clean shirts where I would find them folded in my drawer. The way he sent lilies anonymously to my hospital locker. The way he would stand at the edge of my bed in the mornings and watch me as if witnessing a miracle. There were also the small violences, the assumption that I would be available, the primary claim on my time and body. My agency sometimes felt like furniture that had been moved without asking. At other times it felt like armor I had chosen to wear because it was practical. One night, with rain like small hammers against the windows, Russo came to my room and found me awake. He sat at the foot of the bed and his hands were bare. "Do you regret saving me?" he asked. "No," I said. The truth needed little polish. "I regret being used to bait. I regret the way people got hurt, but I don't regret keeping someone alive when they needed it." He looked at me like someone trying to read a book in a language he thought he knew but didn't. "What do you want?" he asked softly. I thought of the neighbor downstairs and the boy on the couch and the old unfixable weight of grief. "I want to be able to go to work without being a story," I said. "I want to be able to grieve my fiancé without being watched." He smiled like a promise that could not be entirely kept. "I'll keep you," he said. It was an ugly sentence and a necessary one, but even with his shelter, the world kept reminding me of consequence. There were nights when the hum of quiet was broken by another knock, the price of living under the shadow of a man who moved his life with red lines. There were rumors of Costa trying a small, vengeful strike on a business of his somewhere in the city. There were times when I would stand at the window and watch for that sound I had come to fear, the dull thud of men who came with numbers. I kept my hands clean in one way and stained in another. I wearing scrubs in a house that smelled like wood polish. I packed my bag for the hospital and promised myself that some part of me would remain the nurse who patched the world, not the woman who became an appendage to an empire. Months later, in a quieter hour when the city felt like it could hold its breath, Marco gave me a small bullet. He left it on my dressing table with a plain note, "For memory." It was a small, ugly thing with no real use, but to remind me that the world I now inhabited had objects that were both talisman and threat. "You don't need to carry it," Marco said when I asked him about it. "I know," I replied. "I keep it because you gave it to me." "If anything happens," Marco began, then cut off the sentence. The rest didn't need saying. Everything was conditional when you lived with people who made decisions with less visible morality. Sometimes when I walked the halls at Mercy General with the quiet rhythm of every day, someone would tell me a story about the night 200 thugs stormed a small apartment and a nurse saved a life. They would tell the story as a sort of parable, about courage or about naivety, depending on who they were and which table they sat at. I would listen with a small, cold distance, and sometimes I would let them have their lesson. Sometimes I would correct a detail that mattered to me, like the way the boy's breaths returned because someone kept pressure, because being trained mattered in chaos. When I went back to Russo's house after a particularly long shift, he waited at the gate. He had a way of looking like he never slept, and yet was always ready. He held a small envelope in his hand, the kind that looked as though it had been sealed again and again. Inside, there was a letter in his handwriting. He had left for me what he called a promise. Privacy for me at the hospital, pay that would make my life simpler for a while, and a place to live that would not be easily touched. He asked nothing of me in black ink. He asked me only to choose. That night I sat on the terrace and watched the city breathe. There were lights that looked like scattered stars and sirens far off, like constellations we had learned to ignore. The world had narrowed down to two choices: a life of relative safety, with a man whose methods and history would always be an overcast, or a life outward-facing, familiar but precarious. I thought of my fiancé's watch and wound it slowly in my hand, feeling the small mechanics click with a reassuring metronome. It kept time regardless of the world. It was a small, stubborn thing. I thought about being useful and being used, about agency and about the weird degrees of freedom you trade for a roof. Finally, I went inside. Russo met me at the door, and he did not make me wait for him to be the one to speak. He put his hands in his pockets like a man who had been given something too heavy to carry and tried to look lighter for it. "I won't tie your wrists with silk," he said, and the sentence was more gentle than I expected. "I'll make what you want to be made available. If you feel trapped at any point, you tell me. If you want to leave, you leave. But understand, if you leave, they will still know where you once slept." "Do you promise that you'll not make decisions for me?" I asked. It was blunt, but I needed to be blunt. He considered it, and then he nodded. "I will try," he said. "I can't promise I won't be possessive. I can promise I won't make decisions that remove your choices." It was the best promise I could get from a man like him. Partial, conditional, and perhaps the only honest thing he could offer. In the end, I took his key. I took the money he offered for the immediate ease of a rent-free month. I kept my shifts at Mercy General and learned the strange dual life of a nurse with a key to a mansion. Sometimes, when I bandaged someone's wound at the hospital, I felt a thread connect to a different set of bandages I had applied to men who carried names and legacies. Sometimes, I resented the way I had to explain absence with polite lies. Sometimes I was grateful for the envelope that paid for grief counseling I never used enough but had begun to consider. The city continued to be a place of choices painted in shades of gray. I was not heroic in some mythic sense. I was not innocent. I had been used as bait. I had saved a life. I had kept working, and I had been offered protection in exchange for proximity. I had, in the calculus of survival, made a choice that would mark me. My hands bore the marks of that choice, literally and metaphorically. They had bled and soothed and bandaged. They had been the instruments of both care and consequence. Sometimes, alone in my small room in the mansion, I would touch the watch and feel that I had kept a promise to someone who could no longer hear it. Russo would not erase the past. He would not make grief leave, but he would hold a wall between me and the men who once thought my front door an acceptable place to make war. On a late morning, I sat in the kitchen with Sophia and watched her fold sheets with an ease that was pure. She hummed while she worked, and I felt foolishly bright with gratitude for the small domestic rituals that meant the world could be ordinary in slender increments. "Are you happy?" Sophia asked me later. Not in the way strangers ask, but in the way women who clean the rooms of great men learn to ask the things that will be saved from silence. "Happiness is not the word," I said. "Safe sometimes, useful sometimes, compromised often." Sophia smiled, and her smile knew something that had nothing to do with me. "We do what we can," she said. "We do what we can." The phrase settled like dust in the beams of morning. It was not a grand manifesto. It was a small truth. I had saved a man with ice-blue eyes. The next day, 200 men had stormed my home because of that choice. I had lived through the consequences. I had accepted protection from the man I had saved. I had not become his property. I had made stipulations. I still worked the shifts that kept me human. In this house, sometimes I would hear the heavy footsteps of another man's empire and feel a pang, like someone smelling a familiar perfume, then remembering it belonged to an ex-lover. There were nights I would lie awake and think of the boy on my couch and wonder if my hands had made his life a better thing, or if they had only postponed another kind of harm. There were nights I would find Russo in the kitchen, holding a mug and looking at me as if I were a map he wanted to learn but could not fully read. "Do you ever think about leaving?" he asked me once, in the dimness of a morning where the city had not yet fully woken. "Sometimes," I said, "but it's not the same as being able to actually leave, is it?" "No," he said, "and if you leave, I will make sure you leave quietly." "I don't want to leave quietly," I said. "I want to leave with my hands in my pockets and the world intact." He looked at me then with something like envy and something like respect. "I don't know how to give you that," he said, "but I can keep you from being taken." It was an imperfect bargain. So many things are. But it was honest, at least in the way negotiated honesty can be honest. It did not pretend the cost was zero. At night, when I lay in a bed that cost more than my old apartment's yearly rent, I would run my fingers over the bandage on my thumb, a small cut from the night 200 men stormed my building. It had healed into a thin, pale ridge. It was a line of memory. It was also a proof that hands mend more than just flesh. They reconfigure loyalties, reshape futures, and sometimes bargain with the darkness until it yields a place to sleep. One morning, months after the storming, I found a simple card on my dresser. Russo's handwriting was neat. It read, "You did what you had to do. You kept someone alive. That is not small." I folded the card and put it in my fiancé's watch box. I rewound the watch and listened to the quiet click of time. Then I locked the box and set it on the dresser where I could see it from the bed. I had chosen a life that was not the life I had planned in medical school or in a small church pew with sunlight on the hymnals. I had chosen survival and agency in the narrowness offered to me. I had saved a Mafia boss, and the next day 200 thugs had stormed my home. There was no single moral to that sentence. There was only the truth of cause and effect, and the messy middle where people live and make choices that are both brave and compromised. I am not proud of every decision. I am not as innocent as I would like to be. I am also not willing to lie and say it was all for romance or adventure. It was for rent, for grief, for the practicalities of keeping my hands from empty pockets. It was for the stubborn belief that people deserve to be kept alive when they can be. Sometimes Russo and I sat on the terrace and watched the city, two people with different languages for love and safety, and we measured out how much of ourselves we were willing to trade for the other. There were no wholesale conversions. There were small negotiations, occasional tendernesses, and the quiet, steady work of living with the knowledge that every protection comes at a price. In the end, the bandages continued to be both emblem and tool. They were the proof of the body being mended and the metaphor for the soul doing the same. I wrapped one last dressing on my own finger and watched the thin white tape cling to skin. The city hummed beyond the windows, indifferent and enormous. I had saved a man who had walked into my life like a storm. The next day, 200 men had stormed my home. I had been battered and blessed by the consequences. I had accepted a key and a safety that would always be partial. I had my hands. The hands that had kept someone breathing, the hands that had been used, and the hands that would continue to choose whether to heal. If this kept you on the edge of your seat, subscribe for more stories where choices are messy and every stitch matters.